Week 10 of the fantasy football season. That means there's only 1 month left in the regular season of your fantasy leagues. We are getting you ready for the playoff push on the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. What's up, everybody? I'm Steven Andres. This week, and like every week on the show, we're taking you through waiver wire picks in Pick 'em Up. Also, the stream team, streaming options among quarterbacks, defenses, and tight ends. And we'll end the show with Stealthy starts. As always, be sure to like this video, comment below, and subscribe to our page. Comment, and we will be happy to answer any fantasy football questions you have for Week 10, or maybe some trade deadlines coming up in your league as well. We begin with Pick 'em Up. These are waiver wire options owned in less than 50% of leagues, and there is one running back that stands out among the crowd: Tampa Bay's Ronald Jones. This backfield has been kind of tough to pinpoint this season, going back and forth between Jones and Peyton Barber, but there was some reason for optimism for Jones last week at Seattle. And that optimism came in the form of legitimate playing time. 20 touches for Jones, 18 carries, 67 yards, and a touchdown. He added 2 receptions for 15 yards. That was part of playing 53% of snaps, dominating the backfield snaps over Dario Goombawale, who only played 27%, and Peyton Barber, who only played 14% of snaps. That means Ronald Jones is a must pick up this week heading into Week 10. Let's move on to wide receivers owned in less than 50% of leagues, and Zach Pascal of the Indianapolis Colts. Fantasy football is funny, right? I don't think any of us thought we'd be mentioning the name Zach Pascal at any point this season, way back during draft time, but here he is. T.Y. Hilton is out injured with a calf issue. He is expected to miss multiple weeks. Zach Pascal in relief has been pretty consistent for the Colts. Last week at Pittsburgh, 5 receptions for 76 yards and a touchdown on 6 targets. That was after in Week 7 against Houston posting 6 receptions for 106 yards and 2 touchdowns. Only 2% owned right now, so he should be available in your league, and he gets a great matchup this week against the Miami Dolphins. So our next option is another receiver in that same game. We're just not sure which one it is. I like either Devante Parker or Preston Williams of the Miami Dolphins going up against the Indianapolis Colts. With Ryan Fitzpatrick at quarterback, this is the first time I'm recommending a Miami Dolphin this season. That offense looks functional. They got their first win against the New York Jets. If Preston Williams is healthy, that would be the priority pickup for me. But he sprained his knee against the Jets, so we have to monitor his health. If it's looking like he is going to be out this week, then Devante Parker becomes the priority pickup. But either of them are possible options among the waiver wire pickups, and it's because of what they've done recently. Look at their production over the past few weeks. Preston Williams last week against the Jets, 5 receptions, 72 yards, and 2 touchdowns on 9 targets, and he's averaging 8 targets per game over his past 6 games. Then there's Devante Parker, who last week had 4 receptions for 57 yards and a touchdown on 6 targets. Since Week 4, he's averaging 14.6 PPR points per game. That is absolutely dependable production when it comes to wide receivers in fantasy football. Moving on to the stream team for week number 10, Ryan Tannehill is my top option for the Tennessee Titans. Shocking, I know, but look at what he's done over the past 3 weeks. 19 plus points in each of those games, capped off by 24 plus points at Carolina in week number 9. He's facing Kansas City this week, and with Pat Mahomes possibly coming back, if that's the case, they're going to have to pass to keep up with that Chiefs offense. Kansas City also top 10 in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks this season. The second option, Daniel Jones of the New York Giants. He gets a great matchup as well in week number 10, taking on the New York Jets. Daniel Jones, we've seen him have some spike weeks this season against poor defenses, and certainly the New York Jets fall into that category. They are allowing 17 plus points per game to fantasy quarterbacks and allowed 3 touchdowns and 23.7 fantasy points to Ryan Fitzpatrick and the Dolphins last week. But this Jets defense also allowed 24 points to Gardner Minshew in week 8, 18.2 points to Dak Prescott in week 6. Jones in week 8 against Detroit, 28 fantasy points, and we all remember what he did against Tampa Bay week 3 in his NFL debut, 34 fantasy points in that one. Moving on to streaming tight ends, and I'm looking at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers for this one based on their matchup. O.J. Howard has been out for the past couple of weeks, but if healthy, he is a very viable streaming tight end option now that he's owned in less than 50% of leagues. The matchup is pristine, taking on Arizona. Howard missed those back-to-back games with a hamstring injury, so monitor his status, but if healthy, Arizona is allowing the most fantasy points in the league to tight ends, 22.1 per game. They've allowed 9 touchdowns to tight ends this season, and that included George Kittle finding the end zone just a week ago in week number 9. Jack Doyle is my next option among streaming tight ends, and we've been mentioning Eric Ebron in recent weeks, but if you look at who is running more routes, it's Jack Doyle. The snaps are pretty much close, but a lot of those snaps are turning into pass routes for Jack Doyle more so than they are for Eric Ebron, and we like that in fantasy football. We don't want blocking tight ends. So Jack Doyle this week taking on Miami. Again, T.Y. Hilton likely out with that calf injury. That means more targets for Doyle, who found the end zone last week against Pittsburgh. And again, we mentioned in previous weeks, the 3 magic words. He is playing Miami. Yes, Miami won last week, but that defense is still not very good, and Jack Doyle should be a security blanket for regardless whether it's Jacoby Brissett or Brian Hoyer at quarterback for the Colts. Moving on to streaming defenses, and I was shocked this defense is owned in less than 50% of leagues right now, but they are. The Baltimore Ravens. This is going to be a hot pickup this week after what they did to New England's offense a week ago, and now they get to face the Cincinnati Bengals, who just benched Andy Dalton during their bye week, and will face Ryan Finley in week number 10. The Ravens defense against New England on Sunday Night Football. 2 sacks, 2 turnovers, a defensive touchdown. The week before at Seattle, only allowed 16 points to Russell Wilson, 2 defensive touchdowns in that one. We mentioned Cincinnati benched Andy Dalton, and Cincinnati was already top 7 in points allowed to fantasy defenses this season. That means the Ravens are a red-hot option coming into this one for week number 10. Second streaming defense option is the Indianapolis Colts. Despite the fact that the Dolphins offense looked good last week in their first win, they were still taking on the New York Jets, and I think the Colts are a viable streaming option in week number 10. Only the Jets are allowing more points per game to fantasy defenses this season than the Miami Dolphins, and Miami top 5 in most sacks and interceptions allowed this season. Before we close up shop, Stealthy starts for week number 10, and a rookie leads us off. Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver Diontae Johnson is having himself a pretty solid rookie year, moving into the starting lineup ahead of Dante Moncrief, opposite of Juju Smith-Schuster in this offense, and his fantasy production has aligned when Mason Rudolph has been at quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Taking on the Los Angeles Rams this week, I would expect Jalen Ramsey to be shadowing Juju Smith-Schuster in this game. That should free up Diontae Johnson, who is averaging 16 PPR fantasy points per game in his first 4 games with Mason Rudolph at quarterback this season. Our next option is maybe a garbage time hero potentially, but it's Jets wide receiver Jamison Crowder. We can't really trust this offense, but we know they're terrible, and we know that Sam Darnold looks to Jamison Crowder as a security blanket, especially in negative game script situations. Last week when trailing against Miami, he finished with 8 receptions, 83 yards, and a touchdown on 9 targets. He was only started in 16% of leagues against Miami, and this week he gets another good matchup against the New York Giants, who have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. And Jamison Crowder, always a threat for a touchdown near the red zone, with Sam Darnold peppering him with targets this season. Our last Stealthy start is a running back and a popular name on this show this season, but we're going back to him. San Francisco 49ers running back Matt Breida, who was kind of lost in the shuffle in many leagues, started in less than 30% of leagues last week after Tevin Coleman had 4 touchdowns the week prior. But if you look at the touches, this is still a 50-50 backfield under Kyle Shanahan's run-first offense. Coleman averaging 16 touches per game, Breida just 14 per game, but you got to remember he left the game earlier this year due to injury pretty early on in the first quarter, so that skews that. It really is closer to 50-50. In my opinion, the most talented back in this 49ers backfield, averaging 5.3 yards per carry, 7.4 yards per reception. If we take away those touchdowns for Tevin Coleman a couple weeks ago, you realize this is an even split backfield. And if you're starting Tevin Coleman because of all those reasons, Kyle Shanahan having a great run-first offense, dominant offensive line, with a 50-50 split, there's no reason to also start Matt Breida in this offense, taking on the Seattle Seahawks in week number 10. Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. As always, if you have a question, I'd be happy to answer it if you just comment on the video below. And best of luck in week number 10.